The road narrows. You're in the back of a jeep, somewhere in Ladakh, the high desert of northwestern India, 8 to 10,000 feet above sea level. The air is different here, thinner. You feel it as a low pressure behind your eyes, a slight weight in your chest when you take a breath, like the atmosphere is doing something it does not do in the places you normally live. Out the left window, a sheer rock face the color of dried blood. Out the right window, nothing. A valley so deep you looked once and did not look again. The driver has not spoken for 40 minutes. You knew this might be uncomfortable before you came. You told yourself you were coming for the landscape, the altitude, the strangeness of the place. But you know why you actually came. You came because 130 years ago, a Russian journalist walked out of a monastery at the end of this road with a manuscript he claimed to have found. A manuscript that described in detail what Jesus was doing for 18 years, between the age of 12 and the age of 30. And you came because you have always wondered, quietly in the back of your mind, in the place you don't say things out loud, why the most documented religion in human history cannot account for 18 years of its founder's life. The driver slows. White walls against a dark cliff. 3 stories stacked above the valley. Hemis. He says the name once, like a fact. The door opens. The air smells of juniper and dust, and somewhere underneath the altitude and the cold, there it is. The feeling you could not quite name before you left home. The feeling that what you were told was not the whole story, that something was missing, that the silence was shaped wrong, too neat, too convenient, too protected. The monastery is right there, and the answer, if there is one, is somewhere inside those walls. My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. I did not find the Himis question through Notovitch's book. I found it through a footnote. I was working through a scholarly commentary on the Gospel of Luke, a serious academic volume, not a popular read. And in the footnotes to Luke 2, verse 52, I found a brief citation. The Notovitch controversy. Dismissed in 2 sentences. The scholarly consensus was clear, the footnote said. The story was invented, fabricated, not worth further investigation. I stopped. I have spent enough time in academic texts to know what a 2-sentence dismissal of a 130-year debate actually means. It means someone decided you don't need to look at this. And I have never trusted that decision when it came from the people who had the most to lose from the looking, so I pulled the thread. Luke 2, verse 52. 4 words. That is the entirety of what the canonical Gospels say about the formation of Jesus between the age of 12 and the age of 30. Luke 2, verse 52. And Jesus advanced in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and men. 4 words about the development of a person who would reshape Western civilization. Let that settle for a moment. Not 4 sentences, not 4 paragraphs, 4 words. Matthew covers the birth and the flight to Egypt, then nothing until the baptism. Mark does not even attempt a childhood. He begins at the baptism. John begins before creation. Only Luke gives us the temple scene. Jesus at 12, sitting among the teachers in Jerusalem, the senior scholars of Judaism, amazed at his understanding and his answers. 1 scene, 12 years old, and then nothing. 4 words, 18 years. The most sophisticated theological mind of his century, and possibly of any century in Western history, developed his entire intellectual, spiritual, and moral framework during a period for which the canonical record provides exactly 4 words. I remember a professor at a divinity school, a retired New Testament scholar emeritus, someone I met at a conference years after I had left teaching, who said something I could not stop thinking about for months afterward. I had asked him how he handled that gap in his teaching, how he explained it, how he led students through the 18 years of silence. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, I teach the Gospel of Luke for 40 years. On day 1, I tell my students, Luke 2, verse 52, is the most astonishing compression in the Bible. 4 words. And I move on, because there is nothing to say. Nothing was left to say. I nodded. He shook his head slightly, like I had misunderstood something. I don't mean nothing happened, he said. I mean nothing was preserved, and that is a very different kind of silence. I have thought about that distinction ever since. Nothing happened, nothing was preserved. Those are not the same sentence, and the difference between them is the size of everything this investigation is about. You've been lied to before. Not dramatically, not the way the movies show it. A confrontation, a revelation, a moment when everything suddenly makes sense, and the person who deceived you is standing right there. Quieter than that. A slow sense, building over years, that something doesn't fit, that the shape of what you were told has edges that catch when you run your hand across them, that the silence in a story is too precise, too deliberately placed, too consistently maintained by people who would benefit from your not asking. You have felt that before, with smaller things, with people who said, "Don't worry about it," when they needed you not to ask, with institutions that said, "Trust us," when the evidence was precisely what they didn't want you to examine. The church isn't saying, "We don't know about those 18 years. They're saying, "You don't need to know." And you've heard that before, from people who needed you not to ask. The shape of that silence is something you already recognize. In 1887, a Russian journalist named Nicolas Notovitch arrived at the Hemis Monastery in Ladakh. Notovitch was a war correspondent, a travel writer, a man accustomed to going places most Europeans had not been and reporting what he found there. He claimed to have broken his leg on the approach to the monastery. He was nursed there for several months, and during those months, through an interpreter, a lama read to him from a manuscript. The manuscript was titled The Life of Saint Issa. In 1894, Notovitch published the account in French as La vie inconnue de Jésus-Christ, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, and the text he published was specific, not vague legend, not mystical impression, specific. Here is what the Issa manuscript reportedly described. A young man named Issa, the Arabic and Sanskrit name for Jesus, left Palestine at the age of 13. He traveled east through Sindh, in what is now Pakistan, through Rajputana, the region of modern Rajasthan. He spent 6 years studying the Vedas under Brahmin priests. He challenged the Brahmin authority over the caste system, siding with the lower caste Vaisyas and Shudras against those who taught that the poor had been condemned by God. He moved south to Jagannath in modern Odisha, on the eastern coast of India. He traveled to Nepal and the Himalayan foothills. He studied Buddhist texts and Pali scriptures. He then crossed Persia westward and returned to Palestine around the age of 29, approximately 1 year before his baptism by John. The narrative is organized in 244 short verses across 14 chapters. Now, I want to be careful here about what I am and am not saying. I am not telling you this manuscript is authentic. I am not telling you Notovitch found exactly what he claimed to find. The scholarly mainstream has reached its verdict on this, and I will show you that verdict honestly. What I am telling you is that the text, if fabricated, is a remarkably coherent fabrication. The geography follows the established trade routes of the 1st century. The theological encounters, the Brahmin conflict over caste, the Buddhist material on liberation from desire, the Zoroastrian elements in the Persian sequence, are consistent with what a 1st century Galilean might actually encounter on those routes. The timeline fits the Lucan gap with suspicious precision. Departure at 13, return at 29, 1 year before the baptism. Either Notovitch was an extraordinarily careful forger with deep knowledge of 1st century trade routes and comparative religion, or something is worth examining here. Both possibilities are interesting. Only one of them has been investigated. The debunking came fast, and it came from serious people. Yes, Max Müller was the Dean of Comparative Religion at Oxford. In 1895, 1 year after Notovitch's publication, Müller wrote a devastating critique. He wrote directly to the head lama of Hemis and received a reply. No Western visitor had been at the monastery in the previous 15 years. No Western man with a broken leg. No manuscript reading sessions. Notovitch, under the pressure of Müller's public attack, partially retracted his account. Archibald Douglas was a British professor who traveled to Hemis specifically to investigate. The chief lama told him directly, no such visitor, no such manuscript. If Notovitch said otherwise, quote, he lies. And Bart Ehrman, a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, whose work on early Christianity is among the most widely read in the English-speaking world, reached the following conclusion in Lost Christianities, published by Oxford University Press in 2003. Today, there is not a single recognized scholar on the planet who has any doubts about the matter. The entire story was invented by Notovitch. That is the scholarly consensus. I want you to have it accurately without softening it. Notovitch, fabricator, case closed. Except the story did not close. Here is the thing about this case. If Notovitch simply invented the manuscript, the story should have ended with Müller's critique in 1895. One debunking, from one of the most credible voices in Victorian comparative religion, directed at the very monastery in question, with a direct response from the chief lama denying everything. That should have been the end. Instead, the counter-witnesses kept arriving, and the counter-witnesses were not credulous tourists. They were skeptics, investigators, people who went specifically to disprove. Swami Abhedananda was a Bengali monk, a serious scholar, a disciple of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, a man with no particular interest in defending Notovitch. He went to Hemis in 1922 specifically to expose the whole thing as fraud. According to his own account, published in his travelogue Kashmiro Tibete in 1929, a lama at the monastery confirmed that Notovitch had indeed visited with a broken leg, and the lama showed Abhedananda a Tibetan manuscript on Issa. The man who went to destroy the account left a believer. When your designated debunker comes back with the same story as the man he was sent to discredit, you are looking at an anomaly. That is not confirmation bias. That is something that requires an explanation. Then there was Nicolas Roerich. Roerich was a Russian painter and mystic who traveled through Central Asia from 1924 to 1925. He was not following Notovitch's trail. He later claimed he had not even read Notovitch's book when he began his journey. In multiple villages across the Himalayas, geographically dispersed communities with different languages, different religious traditions, different cultural contexts, Roerich documented oral legends of a holy man named Issa who had passed through the region decades before. The stories were consistent. The name was consistent. The timing was consistent with the Lucan gap. Independent oral traditions, not one source. Multiple. Geographically separated, culturally distinct, all telling the same story. He documented this in Altai Himalaya, published in 1930. And in 1939, Elisabeth Caspari, a Swiss musicologist visiting Hemis, reported that a lama showed her books containing the life of Issa. 3 separate witnesses, 3 separate decades, 3 separate accounts of the same thing. That is the shape of the evidence Notovitch left behind. Not proof, but also not nothing. You always felt that the Gospels left something out, not by accident, not because the disciples were careless, because the thing that was left out was the thing that explained everything, where the wisdom came from, why the teachings were what they were. How a tradesman's son from Galilee, in a world where fewer than 3% of people were literate in any language, became the most theologically original voice of his century. You always felt that. The formation explained the ministry. The preparation explained the content. The 18 years of silence, if filled, would show you something the church could not afford to show. Not because it was false, because it was too explanatory. You were right to feel it. That intuition was not weakness, it was not heresy. It was the most honest part of you, paying attention to the evidence the text itself keeps pointing toward. J.J. Benítez spent 40 years investigating the documentary record of early Christianity. 15 research trips to the Middle East, 30+ volumes across multiple languages and institutional archives. A scope and duration of sustained fieldwork that no other popular writer on this material has matched. Benítez's engagement with the question of Jesus's formation is not about the Notovitch manuscript specifically. It is about what the question itself reveals. In Kabbalah de Troya, specifically in the 4th volume Nazareth, Benítez reconstructs the years before the public ministry through his time-traveling witness Jason. The reconstruction is careful and specific. Benítez does not place Jesus in Tibet. He does not endorse the Himis narrative as a literal historical account. But what he does is more structurally interesting. He insists that the formation was extraordinary, that the knowledge Jesus demonstrated was not available from any synagogue in Galilee, that the education cannot be explained by the standard first-century Jewish curriculum, Bet Sefer, the Mosaic texts, the local synagogue tradition. Benítez writes, "He did not become who he became by reading what every other Jewish boy in Galilee read." And then he asks the question the church has never answered. Where did the knowledge come from? The Sermon on the Mount contains ethical and philosophical content that has no precise parallel in any text available in first-century Galilee. The synthesis is extraordinary. The Beatitudes, as a structured system of moral inversion, require a level of philosophical sophistication that the standard Jewish education of the period did not produce. The encounter with the Brahmin caste system, if the Issa narrative is accurate, would explain the specific moral logic of "blessed are the poor in spirit." The Buddhist material on detachment from desire would explain elements of the teachings on wealth and the kingdom. The Zoroastrian material would explain the specific structure of certain eschatological claims. This is not proof, but it is what historians call explanatory coherence. The formation, if it happened roughly as the Issa narrative describes, explains the teaching in a way that the standard alternative, the simple carpenter's son who read only what was available in Galilee, cannot. And that coherence is exactly what the church has never been willing to examine directly. Now I want to be honest about where the evidence stands, because you deserve that honesty. Bart Ehrman is not a villain in this story. He is a serious scholar with a consistent standard. His standard is independent historical verification, and by that standard, he is right. The Notovitch manuscript has not been independently verified. The chain of custody is broken. The witnesses are inconsistent. The lama who told Abhedananda one thing told Douglas the opposite. The oral traditions Roerich documented could have other explanations. The manuscript, if it ever existed in the form Notovitch described, has never been produced for independent examination. I accept that standard. I apply it seriously. But I also want you to notice what it leaves open. The Church has had 130 years since Notovitch's publication to settle this question permanently. Ladakh is accessible. Hemis Monastery is open to visitors. There is an annual festival there every year that draws tourists from Europe and North America. Modern scholars have gone, researchers have gone. A church-commissioned independent investigation of the Hemis archive, a systematic paleographic examination of whatever manuscripts the monastery holds, conducted by credentialed scholars with no institutional stake in the outcome, would either confirm that there is nothing there, or it would find something. That investigation has never been published. 130 years. The monastery is still there. When an institution has the access, the resources, and the organizational capacity to disprove a story that has been circulating for over a century and chooses not to conduct the investigation, that choice is itself a data point. Absence of investigation is not the same as absence of evidence. It is a decision, and decisions are made for reasons. Here is the question Benítez returns to across decades of research. What would the church actually lose if the Himis narrative were true? Not spiritually, institutionally. If Jesus traveled through India and the Himalayas during the 18-year silence, if he studied under Buddhist and Hindu masters, if he engaged with Zoroastrian traditions in Persia, then the theology he developed was not unique to Judaism. It was a synthesis, a deliberate, sophisticated synthesis drawn from the best of multiple traditions, filtered through a Jewish framework, and presented as if it had emerged whole from within that framework alone. That synthesis is not a diminishment. It is, if anything, a more extraordinary achievement than the alternative, but it would mean that Jesus' teaching belongs to a wider human conversation, not to one institution, not to one tradition, not to the one organization that has spent 2,000 years insisting that its founder's intellectual and spiritual formation was entirely internal to its own tradition. If the formation was global, if the wisdom came from India and Nepal and Persia, and not just Galilee and Jerusalem, then the institution that claims exclusive ownership of that formation has a problem, because the formation would belong to everyone it drew from, and you cannot build a monopoly on a synthesis. That is what the Church cannot examine, not the manuscript specifically. The question the manuscript asks. The monastery at Hemis is still there. White walls against a dark cliff. The festival happens every year. Tourists go. Photographs are taken. The masked dances are scheduled and performed and documented on travel websites with ratings and reviews and tips about altitude sickness. People do not go for the manuscripts because the manuscripts, if they exist, are not on the tour. The part of the building that contains whatever is stored in the archive, the part of the building that was accessible to a Russian journalist with a broken leg in 1887, to a Bengali monk in 1922, to a Swiss musicologist in 1939, that part is not shown to visitors. It is simply not part of the tour. You do not have to think of this as suppression. You can think of it as ordinary institutional management. Libraries have restricted sections. Archives have access protocols. Not everything that exists in a building is available to everyone who enters it. That is normal. But in this specific case, in this specific building, the thing that is not shown to visitors is the thing that a 130-year-old controversy says might be there. And the institution that has the most to lose from what it might contain has never commissioned the examination that would settle the question. Both of those things are true at the same time. And the space between them is exactly the shape of the silence you recognized when you first came to this. I am sitting at my desk right now. I have two books open in front of me. On the left, my copy of Notovitch's The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, a modern reprint of the 1894 French original. I have been through it 4 times. The margins are full. I know which passages I trust and which ones I don't, and I have tried to be honest with myself about the distinction. On the right, my copy of Kenneth Bailey's Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, published by InterVarsity Press in 2008. Bailey spent 40 years as a New Testament scholar living in the Middle East, Egypt, Lebanon, Israel, Cyprus. His analysis of the Lucan nativity narrative is the most careful geographic and cultural reading of that material I have found. He does not mention Notovitch. He is doing something completely different. But he says something about the formation question that has been sitting with me since I first read it. He says, and I am paraphrasing, not quoting, that the first-century Jewish tradition of learning was built on the principle that wisdom was not invented from scratch by each generation. It was received, preserved, transmitted, built upon. The question was never, did you come up with this yourself? The question was always, who taught you and who taught them, and where does that chain go back to? The rabbinical tradition is built on that chain. The Torah is transmitted precisely because transmission matters, because the source matters, because the origin of understanding is not incidental to its content. And yet for 18 years, the 18 years that produced the most theologically original teacher in Western history, we have 4 words: advanced in wisdom. The professor I met at the conference spent 40 years teaching Luke. He told me he moved on from that verse because there was nothing to say. What he meant, what he did not quite say, but what I heard in the pause before he said it, was that the tradition he was part of had decided there was nothing to say. Not because the question was answered, because the question was costly. There is a difference between a question that has no answer and a question that has an answer nobody wants to give. I have been sitting with that difference for years. The 2 books are still open in front of me. Luke 2 verse 52 on one side, 244 verses about a young man named Issa on the other. The question is not whether Notovitch told the truth. The question is why the silence cost so much to protect. That question has been there since 1894. It is still there, and it will stay there until someone with the access, the authority, and the absence of institutional self-interest finally walks into the part of that monastery that is not on the tour. The air smells of juniper and dust. The door is still closed. This is Nathan, Forbidden Gospels. Think about that for a second.